back in March of 1868. And in that month, there's a fellow called Jay Gould who set off for Albany, New York, carrying with him a suitcase full of cash money. Now, as many of you certainly know, Jay Gould was one of the most brilliant Wall Street operators of his day, and at that particular moment, he was struggling with Cornelius Vanderbilt for control of the Erie Railroad. Now, Vanderbilt really wanted the Erie Railroad, but Gould and his partners who held it kept Vanderbilt out with a strategy that you and I would today call illegal. And so ultimately and inevitably, the contest between these legendary capitalists became a fight over the law, with each side buying up its own set of judges. And before long, they were doing combat down there in Albany, the state capital of New York. And from his hotel room there, Jay Gould would dispense tens of thousands of dollars to any willing New York state legislator, while Vanderbilt's agents, in their hotel down the way, would hand out tens of thousands of dollars more. A lot of money in those days. Fabulous stories were told of the amounts which the contending parties were willing to expend, wrote Charles Francis Adams. Never before had the market quotations of votes and influence stood so high. As I said, this was the golden age of American capitalism, and our culture worshipped entrepreneurship. It gloried in the production of millionaires, and it generated ingenious scientific theories to rationalize the concentration of wealth into the hands of a tiny sliver of the population, to tell us why the market's way was God's way. Now, for the rest of the country, you know the story, right? For the rest of the country, crowding into the big cities and the dark satanic mills, it was a golden age of human misery. Unregulated capitalism meant toxic food, dangerous workplaces, grinding poverty, even if you worked hard, destitution in old age, and massive, desperate, bloody strikes. Now, while all this was going on, the logic of entrepreneurship came to dominate our politics as well as our commerce, and wholesale bribery in the Jay Gould manner was only the beginning of the story. As capitalism became more sophisticated in the 19th century, so too did the political instruments available to money become more and more sophisticated, advancing from simple influence buying to a kind of final integration of business and the state. When there was a St. Louis reformer in the 1890s who was talking to Lincoln Steffens. Y'all remember Lincoln Steffens? Nobody remembers Lincoln Steffens. But this guy said, "It is good business that causes bad government." And when he said that, I think he captured the entire era in a single sentence. Now, back in those days, as y'all know, there were plenty of people who wanted to reform the political system, but it took a very long time for them to figure out exactly how to go about doing it. They tried things like setting up a nonpartisan civil service, but it was never any use. Political democracy was meaningless as long as money controlled its machinery, as a famous historian once put it. So what those reformers in the 19th century eventually figured out was that you could not root out corruption without bringing capitalism itself to heel. We cannot join economic inequality and political equality, wrote the theologian Walter Rauschenbusch. You had to solve both problems at the same time, both the immiseration of the workers and the corruption of justice, or you couldn't solve either one. Today, it seems as though we are learning these lessons all over again, doesn't it? I mean, it is no coincidence to me that the principal malefactors in both of the biggest scandals of the last 10 years, by which I mean Enron and Abramoff, that all of the big players in these scandals were true believers in the free market. I mean, it's not just by chance that you can find on the right in Washington, D.C., that you can find theorists who think government has no business outlawing insider trading or price fixing, that you can find theorists, it's kind of comical nowadays to think, sorry, excuse me. You can find theorists who think there's nothing wrong with price gouging or with kickbacks, and I'm really serious about that. And you can even find theorists who think that bribery has a righteous role to play in the system too, that bribery is just business acting in self-defense against the hated liberal state. Now, Today, our culture again worships the billionaire and again understands market forces the way our ancestors understood God. And once again, the top 1% of the population makes as much as the bottom 50% put together. And for almost 30 years now, leaders of both of our political parties have gushed over the possibilities of entrepreneurial government, of what George Bush calls market-based government. And the instruments that we have developed to expose government to market forces, to put government itself up for sale, I think would have dazzled Jay Gould. Think about it. Governments like our present one routinely appoint industry lobbyists to run the regulatory departments that oversee those very same industries and put people, as we are finding out, to our cost. And routinely put people hostile to some particular branch of government, like, say, the Social Security Administration, in charge of that branch of government. Now, examples of this come up all the time. Recent ones would include how our genius banking regulators completely missed the crisis in bad mortgage debt. What is it, credit default swaps? That's the word we're all going to have to learn this week. Nobody even heard of that, a month ago. Another example is how the Federal Aviation Administration, it turns out, came recently to, or during the Bush administration, came to regard the airlines rather than the public as their customers, and that is the word they used to describe them. That was their customers, not you and me, but the airlines. And the consequence of that, of course, is to go easy on the airlines when the time comes for inspection, and then you know what happens after that. Or the story that came out just last week about some obscure branch of the Department of the Interior. It turned out it was so cozy with the oil interests that they were supposed to be, extracting revenues from, that they were actually physically getting it on with these guys, And the cliche in D.C. is that that a certain agency is in bed with industry, and these people actually were. It's no joke. Now, so I wrote this book, The Wrecking Crew. And somebody's got a copy here. You see, it's sort of white, and it's got a nice little picture on the front. And what I thought I would do is set out to survey the extent of the wreckage, and to see just what conservatism has wrought in its years in power. Now let's start with, I mentioned earlier the nonpartisan civil service, right, which was set up in the 19th century, and which you find in every advanced Western industrial democracy. It's a no-brainer for most countries in the world. But our American conservatives hate and despise it. They call it the permanent government. It's supposed to have a entrenched liberal agenda that you have to beat down with a strong hand, Now, one of the most, and by the way, Mitt Romney, this was something that he spoke about at the Republican convention just 2 weeks ago, in case you missed it. One of the most peculiar things that I found while I was doing the research for The Wrecking Crew was this 1928 interview with a former president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who back then, just as they are today, is one of the big powers in conservative D.C. And in this interview in 1928, dude made this proclamation. Here's what he said: "The best public servant is the worst one." Okay? Think about that. The best public servant is the worst one. Well, what did he mean by that? Well, he's quite explicit. He goes on to explain it. Talented people need to be kept out of government at all costs. Well, why is that? Because if you have talented people in government, then government will work, right? And if government works, then people will start to trust it, and they'll hand over more and more power to it. And that, of course, is the first step on the slippery slope to communism. Now, this is when I first read this story, I thought, that's pretty crazy. That guy's a nut. And then it turned out that this is not a peculiar idea at all, that this is something that you find echoing all the way down through the history of the conservative movement, right down to our own time. This idea that you have to keep the best and the brightest out of public service. The ideal public servant in the sort of conservative movement literature is a movement loyalist. Now, the most direct statement of this principle comes from Grover Norquist. He's probably the most brilliant strategist on the Washington right. Now, when I read this, I'm going to read a passage from a speech that Grover gave back in 1986, but I want you to remember earlier that the president of the Chamber of Commerce back in 1928 was afraid of that slippery slope to communism. Okay, now here's what Grover said in 1986. First, we want to remove liberal personnel from the political process. Then, we want to capture those positions of power and influence for conservatives. Stalin taught the importance of this principle. He was running the personnel department while Trotsky was fighting the White Army. When push came to shove for control of the Soviet Union, Stalin won. His people were in place and Trotsky's were not. With this principle in mind, conservatives must do all they can to make sure that they get jobs in Washington. With that principle in mind, I think sometimes that it's a very short walk from the teachings of Uncle Joe to the to the Justice Department of today, in which it turns out that a recent graduate of Pat Robertson's law school was screening potential employees for their views on gay marriage, placing right-wing friendlies in important jobs, and helping to fire 9 far more experienced U.S. attorneys for reasons of insufficient conservatism. And have you all heard about, there's some questionnaire that she was making people fill out. You all know about this? Whether the question was, what is it about George W. Bush that makes you want to serve him? I sometimes think I'm going to go down to the Department of Justice and apply for a job just to fill that out. That's okay, so let's pretend that you are a conservative and you're trying to figure out how to deal with this problem of the civil service, the permanent government, right? These people that you hate and despise. Now, what are you going to do about them, right? Since it is a basic principle of conservatism, by which I mean it is an axiom, a cornerstone, an immutable law of human nature, that turning over government operations to the private sector is the most efficient way to get things done. The obvious answer to the problem of the civil service, you know what it is, right? Outsource it, right? Just like you do everywhere else. Turn it over to the private sector. And this, it turns out to be the signature gesture of conservative administrations, handing over public functions to the private sector, everywhere from New Orleans to Baghdad, and from the Department of Homeland Security to, yes, the Central Intelligence Agency, which they are privatizing right now as we speak. Now, in reality, as you know, if you read the newspapers, the conservatives' outsourcing system has turned out to be a ripoff of mammoth proportions. I mean, in each of the Bush administration's 3 great initiatives, the 3 things that it will be remembered for, for all time, Homeland Security, recovery from Katrina, and the rebuilding of Iraq. In each of these 3 initiatives, privatized government was given the starring role, and in each case it proved itself to be a gold-plated botch. I mean, again and again, and despite a veritable river of dollars, it failed to deliver what was promised. Today, the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security routinely accept contracts so stupidly written that they seem to have been designed more as a way just to, sluice our billions of taxpayers' dollars into the contractors' pockets than actually as a device for getting something done. And of course, since these companies are private, the contractors are largely shielded from oversight and accountability. And you can test this yourself. When this is done, get out your cell phone and call Blackwater, right? Get those guys on the horn and ask them what they're up to in Iraq and see what they say, right? See what the answer is. Because, well, all right, I'm not going to hint. They're not going to tell you. Okay? It's a private company. And this problem of oversight and accountability it's actually much worse than that. One of the more peculiar conservative maneuvers that I noticed has been to shut down the agencies that are assigned to monitor the outsourcing, so that then the market can do its magic without any scrutiny from government at all. The best example of this is in Iraq. You know how you get these stories coming out of Iraq every couple of weeks or so, how they sent tens of millions of dollars to a contractor to build some kind of building. Then the reporter will go out to look at the building site, and it's just a big hole in the ground, and the contractor's left the country, and who knows what happened to all the money. All of these reports are coming out of the same office over there. It's this guy called the Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction. And there's a right-wing, I shouldn't say that. a conservative congressman from Southern California who has tried several times to defund the Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, to shut that office down altogether, so those stories stop appearing in the newspaper. So once we recognize this pattern, we can start to see the model extending all the way across our winger wonderland of Washington, D.C. Outsource the job, orders the free market ideology, and a contractor is duly chosen. But not just any contractor, and not even the low bidder necessarily. It always has to be a contractor whose political bona fides are well known, right? Who's ready to tithe back to the movement that gave it to him, who's willing to help build one of the ideological retirement homes, you know, the think tanks, the lobby shops, that'll furnish our conservative friends with a plush free market sinecure once their days in public service are done. Now this water, this is why I come to Atlanta, for the water. There's just some of that Fiji water where they fly it in from the Pacific. Now, all of this brings up the related problem known as, what we clever Washington insiders call the revolving door, in which government workers, and sometimes even our elected officials, appear to do these sort of astounding favors for private companies, and then lo and behold, take these extremely lucrative jobs at those very same private companies once their time in government is done. And there are countless examples of how this works. But my favorite one remains the people who wrote the Bush administration's prescription drug benefit plan. You all know about this story? How the, of course, how the administration got these guys from the, from the for-profit medical industry, and they wrote the law and then immediately went back to the for-profit medical industry as soon as they'd finished their work. Excuse me, of course, work that turned out to be incredibly shoddy from the perspective of we the people, but immensely profitable from the perspective of their once and future employers. And this is not just one or two guys that did this. This was fully 15 of the public officials involved in writing the prescription drug benefit plan who left for the greener pastures of big pharma once the job was done, including a powerful House committee chairman who became a lobbyist for big pharma to the tune of over $2 million a year, which is, by the way, a lot more than what a congressman earns. Now, probably the most consequential wrecking job has been within the federal agencies themselves, and in particular, the agencies that were set up by Congress to perform some task that annoys or inconveniences business, like the EPA or the Department of Labor. And since you never hear about the Department of Labor outside of Washington, and in fact you never hear about the Department of Labor inside of Washington, you never hear about it at all, this is what I want to talk about tonight. The poor old Department of Labor, which the Bush people have stuffed with cranks and zanies of the deepest hue, giving special priority to anti-labor activists. And the Department of Labor just sends people racing for the exits. You can never even mention it. But the dude who check this out. The dude who oversees the Employment Standards Administration, it turns out, was the author of a 1995 report called "How to Close Down the Department of Labor." Yeah. Give that man a job. The man in charge of OSHA came to his job from a union-busting law firm. For Secretary of Labor, the president first proposed Linda Chavez, who is famous for her smoldering hatred of the labor movement. When she didn't work out, Bush replaced her with Elaine Chao, a woman who believes it is a crushing indictment of her own department's regulations to point out that they contain more words than the Bible. The department's chief economist in the early days of the Bush administration, the chief economist was not only a ferocious enemy of unions, I mean, we expect that by now, right? But he was an advocate of allowing entrepreneurial prison wardens to bring back convict labor, right? Now, fortunately for us, this fellow departed early on in the Bush years to start his new career as a 9/11 conspiracy theorist. The Department of Labor's chief information officer is formerly a right-hand man to Jack Abramoff. There's even a senior advisor to the secretary who appears regularly on Fox News to talk about intelligent design. And by the way, so all of this is what we call in Chicago fucked up design. You're going to have some trouble with that on the radio. I'm sorry about that. Now, the last point that I want to make, or I could repeat it in a sort of, a cleaned up way. Yeah, well, we'll do that later, okay? Now, the last point that I want to make tonight is about the word conservative itself, the idea of conserving the society that all of us were born into. Back in 1965, when I came into the world, America was enjoying one of the greatest periods of prosperity in history. In that year, U.S. GNP went up by 6.5%, okay? Now remember, in these glory days of the billionaire, it barely gets over 2% a year. When it gets over 2% a year, it is a banner year for American business. But in 1965, it grew by 6.5%. And that was in line with the official stated goal of American economic policy, a growing abundance widely shared. Can you believe that our government ever committed those words to paper? A growing abundance widely shared, right? That's who we were. We were the affluent society. We were supposed to be the great land of equality. Taxes were high. Regulations were onerous, I suppose. And the richest man in the world was the oil baron J. Paul Getty, who was worth between $1 and $2 billion and fond of complaining about how hard it was to be rich, since these days, meaning 1965, even the middle-class man had access to what once had been the exclusive privileges of great wealth. Aww. It was hard for J. Paul Getty. And he wrote article after article complaining about this. Okay, now look at us today. Okay, after 30 years of so-called conservative rule, through the smoke and the wreckage of the liberal state, we can now dimly perceive the approach of a new and unfamiliar America. This coming colossus is not the product of some, awesome and irresistible force like globalization, but rather it's the product of decades of hard political work, of careful bureaucratic sabotage, and an occasional shot of lobbyist money. The outlines of the accomplishment are unmistakable. American productivity gallops along every year, but since workers' organizations are basically out of the picture these days, only the people at the very top of the pyramid benefit from the advance. Last year, there was a hedge fund manager who made $3 billion in the course of the year, more than J. Paul Getty piled up in his entire lifetime. And I suppose that is a great accomplishment for us as a nation, that we've got one more billionaire to be proud of. Hot damn. Right? Isn't that great? But think about the cost. Think about what it costs to raise us up another billionaire. Sudden outbreaks of deadly food poisoning, train derailments, deadly mine accidents, tap water that is unfit to drink, mysterious workplace diseases that, upon investigation, it turns out could have been easily avoided at only a slight expense to management. But all of it made possible and even made unavoidable by a philosophy of government that regards business as its only important constituent. Now, it is obvious to me, after all this, that throwing the rascals out is no longer enough. The problem today, I think, is structural. I think it is inscribed on the map of Washington, D.C. It glows from the illuminated logos on the contractors' office buildings. It is built into the systems of governance themselves. One of my friends summarized this for me concisely one afternoon as we were having lunch in one of those. Y'all know where Crystal City is in Washington, D.C.? It's right by the Pentagon. And we were in one of those restaurants where the Army officers get together with the contractors, in their ties, and they talk about, building remotely operated turreted weapons systems or whatever the hell it is that they're building this year. I just made that up. I don't know. But this is where they get together and eat, and then behind them you could see this, this panorama of contractor office buildings. Here's KBR, right across, Kellogg Brown and Root, who are running the reconstruction of Iraq. Right across the way from them is McDonnell Douglas. Then there's Boeing. Then there's SAIC, and right down the street, one after another. And so my friend sort of sweeps his hand so as to take in all of, our fellow diners and the contractors' office buildings beyond. And he said to me, so you think all this is just going to go away if Obama gets in? I mean, this whole industry, this whole economy, all these profits just go away. He was right, of course, and he was right, I think, on an even grander scale than he meant to be. Back in Jay Gould's day, in the classic period of business government, we had an epidemic of public theft in this country that persisted despite a long string of reformers in the White House. Republicans after Democrats after Republicans, each of them promising to clean the place up, and nothing ever worked. And the reason nothing ever worked was really simple, because democracy cannot work when wealth is distributed as lopsidedly as theirs was then and as ours is again today. The inevitable consequence of plutocracy, then and now, is bought government. As Justice Brandeis said about 100 years ago, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. It's a bitter lesson that we're going to have to relearn all over again. Because whenever there was a choice to be made between free markets and free people, between money and the health of society, our conservative friends consistently chose money. I say it's time to make them answer for it. Thank you very much.
And we've reached the question and answer period. So if you all would like to ask a question, please step down to the microphone. This is being recorded, so of course we can all hear the question.
I'm sorry
so.
about that. You were serious about that, weren't you?
There'll be one of those
I've already botched it, yeah. By the way, did you mention that I'm going to sign books later? So that nobody leaves?
He will sign books following his talk in the little room over to the side. Wordsmiths has books, and a portion of the proceeds from the book sale do come back to the Georgia Center for the Book.
As with most critics, we sit back and pay attention, but invariably we always ask the same question. What is your answer to your critiques?
Okay, next question. Come on, what do you think I'm really going to answer that? I'm a historian, man, not a fortune teller. No, what is the answer? Well, I mean, the thing is that the system it's answering for itself right now as we speak. I mean, it is the financial order is crumbling around our ears, and I mean, it's no joke. We are seeing the consequences of years of this crap. Of deregulation and people asleep at the wheel. And what's also interesting is conservatives who have told us for years that government cannot work under any circumstances. I mean, look at Paulson and Bernanke right now working desperately. They're actually doing a good job. I mean, hey, you got to hand it to them. They're working around the clock every day, desperately trying to rescue this damn thing and prevent 1929. And we don't know if they're going to be able to pull it off yet. It's an amazing situation, but it is now I shouldn't say it's discrediting itself, because then you'll say, well, then why the hell do I need to read The Wrecking Crew? Well, I think another thing is that I mean, there's steps that can be taken, but the last chapter of the book is about how conservatives have worked for, they have the word permanence. They love to throw around the word permanence. And the idea has been, it's not to, how Karl Rove used to talk about winning a permanent majority. They were going to defeat the Democrats for all times and this sort of thing. And that was hogwash. But in other ways, they did, strive for permanence in other regards, and they were more successful. And what they mean by that, and I have a bunch of different people talking about how we have to make our changes permanent, is that they wanted to remove liberal options from the table forever, so that you could not have a New Deal all over again, or you could not have a Great Society all over again. And by the way, this has been done in a number of different countries where they've written it into the Constitution. or they've taken on such massive public debt that there's no way you can have, say, a national health care system or something like that. There's a number of, or they sign, various treaties that you can't get out of that bind you to this sort of free market way of doing things. There's all sorts of ways of doing it, and some very ingenious. The most clever one was Social Security privatization, and that sort of failed. In fact, that failed resoundingly. But what can we do to fight back? The problem is what they did succeed at, privatizing and outsourcing the government is going to be extremely difficult to reverse. The government, when I would talk to people in DC about this book, they would use the term thematized to describe different agencies. This agency has been thematized, by which they meant it had been hollowed out. The best talent had gone off to the private sector, or people had quit, people were dispirited. They were tired of hearing their boss, the president, talk about, how awful they were, and they had left. And so the government has to be essentially rebuilt from the ground up. And, numerous people would insist upon this to me. And I think that, we're very fortunate in this election that we actually have a really interesting election, but also that I think Barack Obama is uniquely positioned to do just that, to rebuild the government from the ground up. For one thing, he respects learning, unlike some of the guys I was talking about tonight. And on the other hand, he's very inspiring to young people. And that's what you're going to have to do, is bring, like the 1930s all over again, bring huge numbers of young people down to Washington to get started rebuilding this thing. I have other ideas too, but I talk way too damn much. So let's go on to something else. Yes, sir.
Hi, I've got two questions. I think you may have answered most of the first one.
I have a problem with doing that.
How do the recent federal takeovers of Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, and the new AIG fit into the conservative worldview? Are these unintended outcomes of inept management by ideology, or a Trojan horse intended to eventually bankrupt the government and shrink it by a massive hemorrhaging of dollars?
Ooh, that's good. I hadn't thought of that latter. I had considered it, but I think it's probably the former. This is desperation. This is panic. And let me take a step back and say that one of the points that I make about conservatism in the book is that it is fundamentally, in power anyways, I distinguish between conservatism in power, what you see in Washington, D.C., and conservatism as you see it on the streets of Wichita, Kansas. A completely different creature, okay? Conservatism in power is utterly and completely opportunistic, and it will throw over its friends and allies, just jettison them when that's convenient. It'll toss over ideas. It'll toss over entire constituencies. And in this case, it's funny because the idea that's hit the skids is the free market itself. They're just like, well, see ya. Hell with that. We didn't really mean that. Even John McCain is like, I'm in favor of regulation all of a sudden, It's amazing that, 180-degree reversal just in a matter of days. They're like, oh, wait, we didn't, all that stuff that we've been talking about for 30 years, we didn't mean it. What stays constant for them, and what they stand for always is the needs of the business community, the needs of the business class, and that's what it's about. And so that is a straight line, right? Back to Alexander Hamilton. But everything else is dispensable. Now, whether they're doing it deliberately to take on debt, I don't think so. Although they've done a lot of other. Have you read the book yet?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so you're referring to the section about the deficits. This is an interesting story. Y'all want to hear this, or should I shut up?
Okay.
Yeah? Okay. No? Look, deficits are another thing where conservatives, they have this brand identity. The Republican Party, we know who they are. They stand for balanced budgets and fiscal sanity and responsible, and they're against deficit spending, right? That's who they've been ever since the 1930s. That's who they are, right? And then as soon as they take power in 1981, what do but run up this enormous, gigantic deficit, the biggest we'd seen since World War II. And then when Bush gets in, what does he do but the same goddamn thing, right? Why? Why do they do this? I think they did it originally by mistake. They were, they really believed this, the supply side stuff. Do you remember David Stockman? And they really believed that they could cut taxes. Drastically cut taxes, and the economy would grow so robustly that that tax revenues would actually increase, allowing them to then have the arms race with the Soviets, right? And that's what they did. And they knew already by the time Reagan was inaugurated that this wasn't going to work, that this was all malarkey. And there's an amazing book, by the way, if you ever want to write something like The Wrecking Crew, one of the books that you're going to have to turn to is David Stockman's memoirs, because the guy is really open about this stuff. He's very blunt about it. That, we figured out, and he was a true believer. He really believed in supply side, and they figured out even before Reagan took office that it wasn't going to work. And they did it anyways. They did it anyways. And they ran up this massive deficit, and then Stockman figured something out. That deficits have a certain a virtue to them, in the sense that they are weapons. A huge deficit like that can be held over the head of the liberals in Congress, and you can make all sorts of demands. It's like, okay, we're going to have, a reduction in force at your department, whatever it is. We're going to cut your staffing by 50% or something like the EPA. I forget how much they cut it by in those years. But just, whatever agency you don't like, you've now got the excuse to just dismantle the damn thing. And they also cut any program that you feel like or demand that it be cut. And then best of all was when they were all done, then they dumped the deficit in the lap of Bill Clinton. And this is a famous story. You know how, you remember in 1992, Clinton ran as something of a liberal, promising national health care, promising massive public works programs. He was going to, do this infrastructure stuff. And right before he was sworn in, his economic team took him aside, and they said, you're not going to be able to do any of your program. It's all, gone. You're not going to be able to do it. And he said, well, why not? And they said, because of the Reagan and Bush deficits. You're going to spend your entire presidency getting the budget back to balanced, or else the bond market will see to it that you are looking at a 1929 sort of situation. And we know that this happened because Clinton went on one of his famous temper tantrums with a lot of very choice expletives. And among other things, he referred to the deficit as Stockman's revenge. This was one of his things. But what's his name wrote about? Bob Woodward wrote about this, and how the deficit forced Clinton's hand. Okay? It made Clinton behave like a Republican. Very interesting thing. Now, if you're a conservative and you're coming into office right after Bill Clinton, and you see that deficits achieved this miraculous result, what are you going to do? Of course, you're going to run up this super huge, humongo deficit and just do the whole thing all over again, By the way, this has been done in other countries too. Naomi Klein's book, have you seen this? The shock doctrine. In all sorts of countries where they have military dictatorships or apartheid regimes or something like that, they've run up this enormous public debt, and then they hand it off to the democratically elected government that follows them. It's like, hey, see ya, there it is, deal with it. I guess you're not going to be able to nationalize industry after all, that sort of thing. So that's my answer. I'm sorry, I blabbed too much.
That's great. That's great.
I'm extraordinarily long-winded. Oh, you have another question?
Well, yeah.
I don't know if that's allowed. All right, go ahead.
Okay. I've been a VA employee for decades and been part of the evolution and near extinction of FEMA that you refer to often in your latest book. I've also had a ringside seat at the enormous ongoing transfer of funds from the Veterans Health Administration to the private healthcare sector as a result of mismanagement under our own heck of a job, Brownie, VA Secretary. Have you become aware of any concerted efforts to target this agency in particular?
No, I don't know anything about that, but I can tell you an anecdote. I'm sure you saw it in the book. My anecdotes are never really related to what you asked. Have you figured that out?
I'll try.
I just tell the same stories wherever I go. So back in 1986, there was this guy was, this is during the sort of full frontal assault on the executive branch that Reagan and company were making, and there was some political scientist was writing about it, and he was trying to stand up for the government and say, look, government isn't so bad. Our public servants aren't so bad. In fact, some of them are quite good. Some of them are really geniuses. And in fact, I think he said there were 8. It's either 8 or 6. I get the even numbers confused. There are 8 government employees who since, whatever it is, 1969 up to 1986, have won the Nobel Prize in medicine. And when I read that, I thought, that's quite remarkable. I didn't know that, and I went back and looked it up, and it was true. And a bunch of them were doctors at VA hospitals around the country. Did you know that? Won the Nobel Prize in medicine, and also some people at the National Institutes of Health. Okay, so then I looked up. I thought, well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I wonder how many have won the Nobel Prize for medicine since 1986. You want to guess? No, 1. 1. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
The foreign affairs correspondent for the New York Times, Tom Friedman, keeps urging the United States to get a coherent energy policy and go green. Do you have any thoughts on why it's taken so long to do this? Especially given the national security implications, the trade implications, the environmental implications? Thank you, sir.
Why it's taken so long? Oh, come on, because of oil, right? I mean, because you've got this industry, they have oil, and they don't want that. I would go for the really simple answer in that case. I mean, do you remember Jimmy Carter talked about better gas? Oh, I found something funny the other day. You remember, The Onion? You all know The Onion, They had this, Our Dumb Century. They had the 1980 presidential campaign, and it was Jimmy Carter and it was going to be a debate between Carter and Reagan, and under Carter it said, let's talk better gas mileage. And under Reagan it said, let's kill the bastards. That was their debate. So, yeah. Any more questions? Let's go drink some beer. No more questions. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
And What's the Matter with Kansas? You wrote about ordinary people being hoodwinked into supporting the extraordinarily rich. And since you wrote that book, we've gone from a war in Iraq that was kind of an invasion. It might have been over quickly, but it's turned into kind of a perhaps perpetual state of war, rivaling maybe the Cold War. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about the idea of a perpetual war being part of this whole scheme.
Well, I mean, see, the problem is that I sympathize with what you're saying, but it's too cynical. I just can't go there. Okay, I'll say this about the Iraq war, though. I mean, the way Bush used it to win the 2004 election, you talk about incentives, right? If that's the case, if you just start a war with some country, any country that you feel like, the country that did not invade us, didn't attack us, and you're like, well, we're invading them, and now I'm a war president, and you got to rally behind me, and our troops are, you got to support the troops, and all the rest of it, if that's how you win an election, and that's how you get what you want, and that's how you can send all the money to your buddies at KBR, then, by the way, and the whole thing just sickens me. The idea of just attacking some country just cause, right? But if that's what you can do, and you're going to actually win, you're going to be rewarded for doing that, doesn't that make it so that every future president, as soon as they become president, just pick a small country and attack them, The fact that we re-elected that guy after he did that. But I'm not going to go any deeper into the notion that we have wars just to prop up the military-industrial complex, although it's probably true. But it's not just the military-industrial complex anymore. I mean, all those companies have branched out. I don't know if we have any government workers here tonight, but I mean they outsource, whether it's EPA or Department of Labor, when they do their outsourcing, it goes to the same companies. I mean, it goes to people like Lockheed and things that you would never think of. Companies that are essentially military, but that specialize in federal contracting. Anybody else? Yes, sir. I don't know. They want us to do this microphone business, but it's very awkward, isn't it?
Back in the 60s, Eugene Burdick wrote a book called A Nation of Sheep. And with all that's going on in the government, as you pointed out, Bush was elected again in 2004. I didn't see Congress doing their job. I didn't see the media doing their job. I mean,
the media was scared.
Well, they also bought into the White House line without investigating it. There was no Bob Woodward or Bernstein out there.
Yeah, well, they actually both are out there. They just suck.
Well,
no, keep going.
But also the public, and I'm very disappointed in our awareness, and I go back to Burdick's title, A Nation of Sheep. I don't think we as citizens did our job also, and I'm very discouraged about that, and I don't know how to re-energize. Are we too much into our multiple electronic gadgets, our televisions, our cars, our own self-interest, without really being aware of what's happening in this country and trying to do something about it?
Well, you know that's true, of course. I mean,
well, okay. So,
but A Nation of Sheep is too hard. That's going too hard on these people. Let me say, first of all, I shouldn't be so mean to Carl Bernstein. Bob Woodward, though, I mean, he's like, you know, there is no more powerful journalist, and nobody was calling the Bush administration on this crap at the time.
Yeah,
they were terrified after 9/11, after what they had seen happen. Now, a nation of sheep. What's funny is that you actually hear this from the right wingers too. They would be referring to people like me when they talk about that. I mean, the movement that I described in What's the Matter with Kansas, these people imagine themselves as being rebels, as being, you know, outsiders. I mean, they don't think that they're propping up the power structure or the wealthy or anything like that. They think they're doing battle with the Eastern elite. What's the word? I mean, liberal elite. This is the word that they are going to ride to victory in election after election after election. This idea that the real rulers of this country are intellectuals, right? And they're rising up against these awful intellectuals who want to, you know, make our kids learn evolution in schools or whatever. That's big in where I come from, or you know, something like that. There's even a biography of George Bush that calls him the rebel in chief. The rebel in chief, yeah. So he's like he's there in Washington, and he's not, you know, presiding over the place as our president and as our leader. He's our rebel in chief. And what else did you say? There's something else.
Well, in grade school, I read this story about the Emperor's Clothes, a little story by Hans Christian Andersen. And as a little kid, I said, that would never happen in a country like the United States.
Come
and
on.
lo and behold, it
can never happen here, right? I mean, there's so many things where you can apply that phrase. But, you know, we shouldn't be so, I'll tell you something. I thought, I become very optimistic just this week about the election, about the upcoming election. I mean, it is a terrible thing what is going on in Wall Street right now, and it is getting worse by the day. But there is one good thing that's going to come out of this, right? Hoover's not going to get his second term. You know?
I hope you're right.
All right.
I hope you're right.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
When John Edwards was a viable candidate for the presidential nomination, one of his big themes was attacking the corporate interest and saying we'll never reform the government until we do something about all the undue influence that they have.
Well, he was right.
Right, but then before that, the Supreme Court sort of prevented putting any reasonable limits on campaign contributions. So how do you stop the money influence if you can't limit contributions?
Oh, God. Well, that's a... Why can't you guys ask me about the 1860s or something? Or like, if you ask me to name the presidents or something and all the vice presidents, I can do that. You know?
Who's going to be the next one?
All right. How to stop the influence of money? Look, there are things that you can do, but ultimately, you have to take a step back and look at where the power of money comes from, and it comes from the enormous inequality in this country. And when we were talking about permanence earlier, and the things that conservatives have done to make their changes to the government permanent so that it's impossible to undo them. They have a slogan. I'm getting away from, you see, I'm slowly meandering away from your question. They have a saying, but I'll come back to it. They have a saying on the right. It's very interesting. It's defund the left. Defund the left is what they say, and they put it on bumper stickers. I have it on a lapel pin. Defund the left, and what they mean by that is you figure out how liberal organizations are funded, and you cut them off. And you don't just, politics isn't just a battle at election time. It's not just Republicans versus Democrats. It's using the power of the state. You capture the state, you use the power of the state to structurally destroy the other side. And they've done an incredibly good job at doing that. You look at what they've done to the labor movement, okay? It's still technically legal to form a labor union in America, but it's de facto illegal, because it basically cannot be done. Organized labor is now down below 8%. And this is just one, they've also attacked the teachers, the public school teachers. For God's sakes, they attacked librarians early on in the Bush administration. They attacked the trial lawyers all the time. These are all parts of the defund the left program, okay? And on the other hand, going the other direction, fund the right? And how do you do that? Well, the enormous income disparity in this country, which is a product of, first of all, smashing the labor unions, and second of all, fiddling with the tax code to redistribute the money upwards, which is what they've done. They've done it very effectively. And once that's in place, I mean, basically, the power of money, the gravitational pull of money in this country is so great that it, has not only pulled the Republicans to the right, but it has pulled the Democrats as well. I mean, they both go to the same people for their funding, the high net worth individuals, the business owners, this sort of thing. And, excuse me, and that's, I mean, it's a self-fulfilling, or what would you call it? It's something that accelerates itself. It just keeps moving. I mean, to the point where it's impossible to run for president unless you can either fund yourself somehow, or you cater to or in basically any other high office, except for in certain parts of the country where, like, say, organized labor is still powerful. It's either that, or you have to appeal to the very wealthy people in your district. How do you change it? You have to change the entire structure. I mean, I'm sorry about this. It can't be done without undoing the plutocracy. But there's an easy way to do that. Card check. Y'all know what this is? Okay, it's a way of, or when you have this is going to get a little bit complicated. When you have a union election and the National Labor Relations Board determines that that management fiddled with it, you can have the election by what's called card check, where workers just sign their name on a card if they want a union. Okay, and there's a bill before Congress right now. It's been passed by the House but not by the Senate to make a card check an equal method with holding an election in the workplace to forming a union. If this was to pass, suddenly it would be much easier to form a labor union in America. And I'll tell you something. I mean, I know I'm in the South, and I know how you people feel about organized labor. But organized labor is what made this country an economic democracy. Okay? It wasn't... So maybe I'm not in the South. I'm confused. It wasn't because politicians were nice, and they got up one morning and said, oh, I think we'll have Social Security or something like that. It's because they were compelled to by movements on the ground. And those movements are gone now. Those movements are moribund or dead, and we have to bring them back. Okay, that's a very long-winded answer, and now I'm shutting up. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
How much? One more? Okay, ma'am, I'm sorry, you're going to have to be the last one. And I am very sorry to make you stand there and listen to all that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Don't tease the man. Come on. Yes.
I'm a retired high school teacher. I'm not hearing much talk about education. When No Child Left Behind came in, bless our hearts, we tried. Because we try hard.
Yeah.
And I tried for about a year, and then I thought, gosh, they're burying me in paperwork. I can't teach anymore. They're holding me accountable holding the schools accountable to ridiculous standards, like if a 10% of a subgroup is absent on the day of the test, you become a failing school, or you start on the path to being a failing school. And then one day I thought, wait a minute, this is a setup.
Yeah, it's designed to discredit you.
This is designed to funnel money into private schools and religious-based schools by proving that the education system as it's constituted and was limping along, but we were limping along, is bankrupt.
Yep.
And so I was old enough to retire. But
well, that's
I've forgotten his name.
And did they privatize your pension plan? No, that's one of the things they're working on,
Rudy Cruz. Rudy Cruz came here and talked. He was the chancellor in New York who Giuliani fired. He's now in Miami-Dade. And he came here to the Gator Book Festival and talked. And I thought, this is going to be the same old crap. He's a superintendent. I wanted to sob through the whole thing.
I'm sorry.
The man knows what he's talking about. Yeah. And I'm just hoping that Obama's our president and that he taps Rudy Cruz. but I'm...
You know, I don't know Obama. Otherwise, I would pass that along.
They're not.
I'm trying to get. I want him to hire one of my friends as Secretary of Labor. That's what I'm pushing for right now.
They're really not talking about it. Why are they not talking about it?
About No Child?
Education and No Child.
I don't know. Look, right now everything has been crowded off the stage. Last week we were all talking about Sarah Palin. I wrote 2 columns about Sarah Palin. You know. And I mean, and now it's like it's like 100 years ago. I mean, who gives a damn about her snowmobile and her Harley? I mean, look at the financial system. Look what's happening to us. I mean, that is crowding everything else out, and I think it rightfully should. I mean, the point that I made in What's the Matter with Kansas is not so much that people vote against their own interests; it's that their own interests, their economic interests, are never discussed in politics anymore in a reasonable way. Well, by God, they are being now, right? And the economy is forcing us to talk about it, and this is a debate that my side is going to win. Thank you very much.